Yeah, just to go over the flow of today's conversation, Karen and Håkon will introduce today's speakers and raise some questions and facilitate a conversation about the diverse approaches to conservation. We will take a few questions, then divide into breakout rooms from around 10 or 15 minutes. And afterwards, we will meet in the main room to hear some reflection and insights. So yeah, please everyone mute themselves when you are not talking. We will turn off the chat function during the first part of the webinar so that we do not get distracted, then open it up again in the question period. During the question period, you can ask a question or make a comment by typing into the chat function or using the raise hands function. And we want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the link and the resources which we shared during the meeting will be sent out after the meeting. Yeah, so now I'm going to introduce Karen and Håkon. Håkon Stokland is a senior researcher scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. His research is focused on relations between knowledge and politics, biodiversity, and transformative change. He is lead author in the ongoing IPBES Transformative Change Assessment, and he is also the main coordinator of the Social Science and Humanities Network, which aims to help improve and contributes to the social science and humanities to IPBES. Karen O'Brien is a professor of human geography at the University of Oslo in Norway and co-founder of Sea Change, an organization that works to engage society with transformations to sustainability. Her research emphasizes integral approaches to sustainability, and she's passionate about transformative change in both theory and practice. She's currently a co-chair of the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment. So Karen and Håkon, over to you now.
Thank you, Rosario. And hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today. And welcome to this second of the transformative conversations that we're organizing. And as you all know, this one will be about rights-based approaches to conservation, and more generally about biodiversity issues, transformative change, and justice. So just to shortly introduce the topic, so biodiversity conservation has a long history leading up to the recently agreed post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And its successes, as we all know, are often celebrated, but many have also argued that it also have had highly problematic consequences, both environmentally and socially. Lately, increasing calls have been made to transform or think radically differently about the politics and governance related to biodiversity. Calls have been made for more social and environmental justice in conservation, rights-based approaches, and better tackling power relations and past injustices. Calls for transformative change of the current biodiversity conservation regime has also been articulated recently. The link between transformative change and biodiversity is still in its infancy. I think we can say that. Although there have been some notable developments lately, conceptually, in establishing what transformative change might look like in the context of biodiversity. And so with this conversation, we hope to highlight and add to the current debates about justice, conservation, transformative change, and biodiversity. And this is why we have invited 5 inspiring experts on these topics today. So over to you, Karen. Why don't you start with the introduction of today's experts?
Great. Yeah, I will start with 3 of the introductions and pass to you. First, I'd like to introduce Bram Boucher, who is a professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University. And he's also a visiting professor at the Department of Geography, Environmental Management, and Energy Studies at the University of Johannesburg. His research focuses on the political economy of environment and development, and his broader theoretical project seeks to bring biodiversity, human non-human relations, and conservation deeper into our understanding of the historical and contemporary trajectories of global capitalism. So welcome, Bram. Great. And the next person I'd like to introduce is Gloria Leo Ortega, who is the head of the Just Socioecological Transition Office at the Ministry of the Environment in the government of Chile. And she's been involved in public policies in academia, government agencies, and civil society for more than 10 years. She's contributed to different studies and publications that address climate action, water governance, and energy transitions in Latin America. And, such as Chile's third national communication on climate change to the UNFFC in 2016, and Chile's nationally determined contributions. So welcome, Gloria. And third, we have Jennifer Corpus, or Jing, who's from the Kankanaey Igorot indigenous people of Basao in the Philippines. Jing is a lawyer by profession and currently the managing director for policy at Neo Tero, where she leads and oversees advocacy efforts for global and national policies to support indigenous governance of territory. She was one of the negotiating leads for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity at COP15, specifically focusing on area-based conservation targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So welcome, Jing. And Håkan, I'll let you introduce the other two.
Right, thanks. So next up is Laila Mehta. She's a professoral fellow at IDS. She trained as a sociologist at the University of Vienna and has a PhD in development studies from the University of Sussex. Her work focuses on water and sanitation, forced displacement and resistance, climate change, scarcity, rights and access, resource grabbing, and the politics of environment or development and sustainability. Additionally, she engaged in advisory work with various UN agencies and has also been active in advocacy and activist work on gender, environment, and development issues with NGOs and social movements. So it's great to have you here today, Laila. And finally, but not least, Matthew Buki Mabele. He's a lecturer and conservation social scientist at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, University of Dodoma, Tanzania, and a visiting fellow at the Center of African Studies, University of Cambridge, UK. He applies political ecology and decolonial perspectives in his research to understand underlying systemic structures and processes that drive socio-ecological injustices and explore transformative pathways for just conservation in the ecosystems. Likewise, it's great to have you here today, Matthew. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great. So let's start the conversation. And I just want to emphasize that a conversation is an exchange of ideas. And so it involves not only speaking with each other, but also listening deeply to each other. And so in the next hour, we want to bring together all of your diverse perspectives and expertise on just approaches to biodiversity conservation. Before we start, we'd love to just hear a brief word from each of you, kind of as an opening, about your personal motivation for this work. In other words, what matters to you and what are the values that really keep you going through your work? So why don't we start with Jing? I have a big smile on your face. So.
Yeah. So, gawisay agaw yu amin, sakon si Jing nagakwak is nan bilbilig nan busaw. I greet you in the language of my Kankanaey Igorot ancestors. And yeah, for me, the answer to the question is obvious. It's the values that my ancestors have inculcated in me. And although, like most indigenous youth, I had to leave the community in order to go to a good school. Especially, there are not many good high schools in indigenous communities. So I had to leave my community at quite an early age. But the motivation is coming from my experience with my extended family, but also neighboring communities, where in the course, well, that's a longer answer, but just these values of spirituality, reciprocity, and regarding the different members of the community, both human and non-human, as creatures that deserve respect, and also the value of being good stewards of our territory and being able to pass this on so that 7 generations forward, they would still have a good place. They would have the values, the traditions, and the territory from us, their ancestors.
Great, thanks. That's a wonderful way to start a conversation. Bram, how about you?
Thanks, Karen, Håkan, and Rosario. For myself, I think it's both personal and professional or intellectual. Personally, I think, like so many people in the world, we feel that the world is out of sync. You know, that the structural imbalances, structural forms of violence that have been there, of course, for centuries, particularly in certain spaces more than others, but are now seem to be intensifying, leading to global planetary crises. Yeah, really affect all of us, you know, differently, but still, I think all of us feel this, and I feel this too, and I worry about this, about people that I care about here in the Netherlands, but also family in South Africa, in other parts of the world, my 10-year-old daughter. So for me, that's really important value that I take with me. And the other is, I think, just studying, you know, the political economy of conservation. I don't see how we could not come to any other conclusion that we need to fundamentally, structurally change the way we do conservation and the way we need to think about human-nature relations. So for me, I don't know, it's also just very logical.
Great, thanks. And let's move to Gloria. What matters to you and what keeps you motivated in your work with policy?
I think this is one of the hardest questions I have been asked. It's when I read it, it was like, how do I answer this? Like, I started just because I wanted, when I started to study nature, it was just because of curiosity and because I just enjoy nature, you know, the contact with nature. But by now I'm 40 years old and I know so much about the dangers that our nature, the nature that got me involved in this career, it's so big. So it's this sense of urgency that keeps me going. Sometimes, like from a very, very personal perspective, sometimes I wish I didn't know as much as I know, because it's threatening. It's like, sometimes it's really scary. But at the same time, I believe that I have something to do about it. There is hope. There is some kind of a path that we can follow. But in order to accomplish that, we need to work together. So I think it's this sense of urgency and that the potential of actual transformation that keeps me going here.
Great, thank you. We're going to explore that potential today. And Matthew, how about you?
Yeah, so for me, it's so being born and raised in Tanzania, one of the countries in the world that has a massive land areas under conservation, and particularly the kind of conservation that is not practically attentive to people's needs and aspiration. So that is something that actually pushes me into this kind of engagement, but also having studied and also being introduced to some of the critical discussions from political ecology, but also from the broadly conservation social sciences. Also, that is something that keeps on pushing me. In particular, today's discussion, I think it's one of those platforms where you can really see the urgency that is required for attention, especially in terms of the people's needs when you think of biodiversity conservation. So this is something that actually motivates and pushes me into this kind of engagements.
Great, and Lila, how about you? What motivates you and keeps you going?
Thank you very much to Rosario, Karen, Håkan for inviting me and for this amazing opportunity for this conversation. I work in development studies, so it's a normative field where we seek to make a difference. And I guess as an academic, it's not just about generating knowledge, but it's also about engagement with what's happening on the ground. So I think challenging dominant perceptions of nature, society relations, of local people's understanding is really critical to my work, and also the disparities. So I grew up in Bombay in India, and then I've lived in Europe for most of my life. So, you know, I'm very, very aware of the dispossession, the disparity, and also the exclusions around gender, caste, race, etc. I've witnessed that. I've grown up with that. So, you know, challenging that, unpacking that is really important to what I do. And what keeps me going is, I guess, just seeing practices on the ground to see the way people are getting on, the way communities are mobilizing, are changing things, are asserting agency. But that knowledge is really invisible very often. And to bring that to the global level, to the policy level, is really what motivates me also as an academic and as an individual.
Thanks, Laila, and thanks everyone for this really interesting background. So now let's move more into the topic of today, and let's start quite simple. So just and equitable conservation is something we hear more and more. But what does it mean in practice? And so is there any aspects you would like to highlight that's more important for understanding just an equitable conservation and what it is? So Matthew, what is your view on that?
Yeah, so I think for me, that it has to take on board social justice, because as I pointed out in the brief introduction, much of biodiversity conservation has pretty much focused on ecological integrity. So much has been sort of trying to see the improvements in the wildlife ecosystems, forest ecosystems, but people's aspirations and needs and interests have been sort of ignored. So for me, that is, I think, one of the very important issues when you talk of just and equitable conservation. But also, I think because of the history and much of conservation happening in the global south, much of these countries were formerly colonized. So I also think the issue of the colonial legacies, I think departing from such legacies is also quite important when you think of just and equitable conservation, because I mean, even currently we are still sort of our conservation is still rooted in such colonial ideals and assumptions, which are most of the cases both are social but also ecologically irrelevant to the existing realities of these countries. So I think putting people more into the picture, but also departing from the colonial legacies are some of the very important issues that need to be put on board when you think of just and equitable conservation. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So social justice and also thinking about the colonial past. So what about you, Laila? Do you have anything to add to that, or do you have more or less the same idea what just an equitable conservation is?
Yeah, I agree with Matthew that we really need to push back against the colonial legacies that perpetuated slavery, racialized discrimination, grabbing of land. And those kind of policies are perpetuated today, especially when you look at lands as empty, unproductive, pristine. We need to preserve them. But really, we have to push back against that, because what seems to be unproductive is actually deeply productive on the ground in terms of what different communities are doing. So this idea of fortress conservation, etc., really has to be pushed back, and really putting people's rights at the center, and also their livelihoods. Their livelihoods are not unsustainable most of the time. They're not unproductive, and there can be synergies. And even when we're talking about climate mitigation and adaptation, a lot of the policies then are going to be maladaptive if we don't take into account local people's concerns. So I think really pushing back against these unequal social racialized power relations is very critical, and also top-down expert-driven processes. And I think, even the current IPES assessment that some of us are involved in really needs to take on board that push back against this expert-driven process.
Great, thanks, Laila. And what about you, Bram? What is just an equitable conservation to you?
Yeah, I very much agree with both Matthew and Laila, and I think the start is, as we call it, historical reparations, right? To deeply think about the past and how we can find ways, to move in one way forward together by acknowledging the painful legacies of the past, by finding ways to, you can't undo them, but you can help to repair at least some of the relationships and some of the things that have been done moving forward, at least. So for me, that is absolutely foundational. But I would maybe add two other elements, or perhaps operationalize elements that have been mentioned already. I think the one element for me really for a just and equitable conservation is to better link different actors, right? Conservation happens in a very uneven space where different actors have different types of impact on biodiversity, on areas, and have different types of relations and power relations in how they impact biodiversity. And so we've been working with several people to develop what we started calling conservation or biodiversity impact chains, to really look at the chains of impact from so-called local communities living next to biodiverse spaces to other actors further away, right? People like ourselves in the way that we consume, but also companies, governments, and other actors that may be further away from certain biodiverse spaces, but actually have a much bigger impact on these spaces, right? So the focus, and I very much agree that we need to sort of centralize local people and communities, but not in a simplistic way. I think we've tried that for quite a long time. And if you responsibilize certain group of people, that they must somehow change their lives to live better with nature, but you leave others with a huge, big footprint out of that equation, right? You will never get to a just and equitable conservation. So for me, that more sort of complex way of linking different actors within a broader, uneven socio-economic terrain, I think is absolutely critical going forward. And we shouldn't be, we shouldn't also be too romantic about it. That means certain actors will have to lose, right, in terms of, their access to certain resources and or the benefits that they derive from, so that others can actually gain and can have a bigger say in this.
Great. That sounds like there's quite a lot of alignment. So, Jing, your work and experience with Indigenous peoples governance, do these ideas resonate with you? And, what is conservation? What does just and equitable conservation look like to you?
Yeah, I think the ideas that have been presented resonate a lot with us, because one of the things that the Indigenous movement has been trying to highlight is that a lot of the, if you look at maps, a lot of maps have been produced recently showing the overlaps between key biodiversity areas and Indigenous territory. And what's emerging is that a lot of the places that are very well preserved may not necessarily be covered as formal protected areas or conservation areas, but are Indigenous territories. And what this shows for us is that we have to start recognizing that a lot of these places that we think are pristine have actually been carefully maintained and managed by Indigenous peoples living in those territories. So and then recently we had this announcement, from the Catholic Church, which is very important for Indigenous peoples. It's an apology and basically rescinding this doctrine of discovery that allowed for colonization of so many Indigenous territories in the past. And all of these things, decolonizing how we do conservation, these are the things that Indigenous peoples are actually fighting for now. And it came to the fore last year during COP15 when we were negotiating the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But yeah, definitely, it's just we need to recognize that for a lot of these places there are Indigenous peoples there, and Indigenous peoples have been carefully managing these places, and that's the reason why the places remain biodiversity rich. But at the same time, also recognizing that we should not, this notion of a noble Indigenous, green Indigenous person, we shouldn't overly romanticize it, and also recognize that there are a lot of influences now on Indigenous communities. For example, just the example, from my life, being forced to move out of the community to get a better education. There's that kind of pressure among a lot of Indigenous communities now. to keep pace with the modern world. So we also have to recognize that there are those changes. However, a lot of us also maintain this desire to go back to our communities. So how do we put value in, just sort of mediate between the indigenous world and the modern world, so that indigenous peoples who have been exposed to the modern world still find value in returning to their communities. And a good example, I think, is in Canada and in Australia, where there are indigenous guardianship programs being put in place. And it sort of brings together this idea that we have to tap into traditional knowledge, but we also have to incentivize indigenous guardians moving back into place and being that link between the traditional knowledge in territory and the modern scientific world. So that's a mouthful, but definitely a lot of the ideas resonate. Thanks.
Yeah, great. And it sounds like you're kind of pointing to some steps forward that are taking place. And so with that, I'd like to just go over to Gloria, because Gloria, you're the head of the Just Socioecological Transition Office at the Ministry of Environment in Chile. And, which sounds like a fantastic department. And so could you describe what your vision or definition of what just conservation looks like in your work, and kind of following up on what the other four have said, can we put that into practice in policies?
Thank you, and thank you everybody for your perspectives. I think it's very interesting. We have not developed a just conservation definition per se, but we have been addressing this issue because we have to, we need to. And I'm going to take some of the words from Bran when you said that before moving forward, we need to first to think about the past and what have been the impacts of development and of big industries, of pollution, depletion of ecosystems, etc. So in our department, we are focusing on what is known as sacrifice zones, which are areas that have been so much impacted by industries that they have lost they have been losing a lot of ecosystem services, and they have been decreasing the quality of their lives. They have been impacted in their health. So they are living a very complex situation. So of course, before moving forward with them, you have to think about the past. And this means not only, for example, repairing any impacts that they have been taking in their health, but also in their ecosystem. So how do we repair? How do we recover these places? Is there a possibility to recover them? Some of them are actually, you cannot go back to the way they were before the installation of these big industries. So you have to think of a way of conserving what you already have, but also trying to restore what have been lost in some way. This is a big challenge because it takes time and it takes a lot of money. So in practice, to think about the past, it is, even though it is absolutely necessary, it takes a lot of effort from the state, but also from the private companies, for example. And this is a conversation that is awkward, because who takes the responsibility? And this is an issue that you need to address very carefully. So the other thing that is very interesting in this concept is, I think Matthew mentioned it, social justice, and I would say also environmental justice. So before going to just transition, we also have to talk about social and environmental justice. And what is justice? This is it is a word that is taken a little bit for granted sometimes, but it's very complex. And you need to assure, for example, distributive justice and procedural justice. And these kind of things are also very hard to put into practice. So how are we going to distribute the benefits from a new industry that is supposed to be greener or cleaner than the old ones? For example, if we're going to close a thermoelectrical energy plant. The next thing that is going to put in there, is it going to be more just than the one that was before? How are the employees are going to feel about it? How are they going to move forward? This also impacts their culture. So it's a very complex situation. Like here in Chile, we have said we're going to close this place. And there's a lot of people that is actually very thankful because we're going to close an industry that is very polluting. But at the same time, you have a lot of other people that depends on that industry. So the conversation between them is tense and it's not so simple. So, and you have to think about how you're going to distribute the impacts from an environmental decision. And here justice becomes a little bit fuzzy. So what is justice for each of these people, for each of these groups of people? And how are you going to accomplish justice with each one of them? So I think it's a very complex perspective. And I think to go from the theory to the practice, it's much harder than it seems. So that would be my perspective.
Thanks, Gloria. That's really interesting. And thanks for taking us into the practical complexities of just conservation. So what about you, Matthew? So what do you think of the current status of biodiversity conservation? And do you see any way for it to transform? So how can it be transformed to improve the situation?
Yeah, so as previous speakers have spoken, I'll just say that the current status is, I mean, it's very complex, with all these perspectives and the dynamics that are going on. But I think biodiversity conservation is built on this practice upon an equal power structures, as we've heard from the previous speakers, because I mean, much of the current activities are taking place in the global south, but also there is quite a huge influence of the global north in terms of funding, in terms of expertise, but also in terms of research, you know. So, and that has created these unequal structures, but also which are sort of also rooted to the colonial legacies that I've just mentioned. But also one other thing that is sort of connected to that is in terms of the kind of approaches that we are using, you know, in terms of this the protected area approach, you know, which is built upon separating people from nature, you know, and this is quite contrary to how sort of things used to be, and that has created restrictive living options for people who depend on those resources and the ecosystem that are supposed to be protected for the sake of, you know, addressing some of the global problems, you know, and also that is also associated with what Bram mentioned in terms of, you know, the thinking around what causes most of these biodiversity problems is that most of the times we tend to ignore the underlying forces that are driving such a problem. Much of in some of the cases has been, you know, the excessive extraction and consumption patterns that are happening in the global north. But when it comes to discussions, much of the time it's just putting blame to people in the global south, you know, in terms of their living options as being destructive to natural processes that are happening in this ecosystem, you know. So I'll just say in terms of the status, I think that is how it is currently. And as previous speakers have spoken, I think we need to change. And the good thing is there are discussions for transformative conservation. And I think that brings or that gives us hope in terms of thinking how we can move from such a problematic biodiversity conservation that has been taking place for many years. And I think one of the ways to sort of move forward, as we have pointed out in this discussion, I think is just to try to embrace the aspects of justice. And in this case, justice being in a sort of a multidimensional aspect, you know, but also one of the dimensions that has not been highly talked I think it's in terms of the epistemic justice, because that's also one of the legacies of the colonialism in terms of expertise, in terms of the voices that are heard in this biodiversity conservation discussion, but also in terms of the kind of people that are engaged in such discussions. So epistemic justice, I think, is quite important because it puts, or it brings us back to the need for multiple ways of knowing and engaging the nature. I think that is also quite important. So for that, I think I'll just point out these things as being quite important when you think of the current status of biodiversity conservation.
You put a point to Matthew, some really important things that are, relevant to both research and policy. And I'll just kind of open it up because I see lots of nods in the group. So just to kind of let the conversation flow, like Lila, Jing, Ron, Gloria, does anyone want to pop in to see like what does it, what does the, like for researchers, what does it mean to go and bring about just and equitable conservation?
Yeah, I could go. I think what Matthew said, he's really started this interesting conversation. I mean, there's a lot that researchers can do in terms of pushing for epistemic justice, social justice, and looking at not just distribution, but also procedural and recognitional issues. And I think one thing is critical is new ways of doing research and science also, and learning and working. So the role of alliances is key, bringing together hybrid perspectives, different perspectives. And I think as researchers, we can call out the bullshit of the powerful actors, both in terms of neoliberal conservation or whatever plans are, different kinds of mappings. I think that's really critical. Also in lifting the invisible and hidden perspectives around conservation and biodiversity that are missing in dominant Western and scientific framing. And again, pushing for that cognitive justice. So I'll give you an example in the Tapestry project. These wastelands are considered to be barren and unproductive, but by bringing together natural science, anthropology, as well as local people's perspectives, we can actually validate some of the herders' perspectives around the mangroves, because there are these camels that swim to the mangroves and they're considered to be destructive. But by looking at GIS mapping, different kinds of mapping, we can also validate local knowledge and push back against this dominant perspective. And so often the focus is on changing local communities' behavior, but actually the behavior that needs to change is that of the scientists, that of the industry, that of the people that are grabbing the land, etc. So I think there's a huge responsibility there and a lot that researchers can do. And finally, we obviously don't want to romanticize local communities. There's a lot of fracture, there's a lot of gender difference, biases, caste, class. And I think as researchers, we also have a responsibility there to point out some of the huge contradictions at the local level, and also the trade-offs, etc., and how they can be bought, played off against each other. And, highlighting some of those painful issues is also critical in what we do. And finally, political economy, global local relations, the consumption patterns, production patterns, trying to reverse some of that, I think is also really critical, because there's no point changing things on the ground if you have wider trajectories of change that just go along one path, which is that of the neoliberal capitalist path, and then nothing you're doing on the ground is going to make a difference.
Great. So did anyone else want to pick up on that? So we want to take some questions from the audience soon, but we have time for one more comment or two.
Hi, yeah, this is Jennifer. This is Jing. And sorry, I see that Gloria has her hand up. Can I go first?
You can go ahead, Jen. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was asked to speak at a gathering in Buckingham Palace, actually, where they were trying to stimulate private sector action on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And they were asking us to talk about transformative change. And, as the Indigenous caucus, groups of Indigenous peoples, we reflected on the words transformative change. And we wondered whether Indigenous peoples and local communities were also being expected to change in a transformative way. And one of the conclusions that we arrived at is that when talking about indigenous peoples, what we actually need is transformative return to the values of reciprocity and spirituality that indigenous peoples have. And it's also necessary to change the way that the current system values different things. No? So that's one side is for indigenous peoples, it's actually transformative returns and recovering all of these values that indigenous peoples have. But also in the outside world, we have to change the way that we value things. And I think that the global biodiversity framework goes a step towards doing this, just trying to empower the agencies in government that deal with biodiversity, trying to empower them so that they also have a say in how economic development takes place. So just trying to put a value in clean air, clean water, all of the ecosystem services that good biodiversity provides, and taking that into account in making economic decisions. So I think that's one of the steps forward that's contained in the global biodiversity framework, just trying to change the way that we value things, but also putting rights-based conservation in the center. And when we were doing an assessment as an Indigenous caucus of what was achieved in COP15, we said that seven out of the 21 or 30% of the targets now specifically mention Indigenous people's rights, whereas the past, the Aichi biodiversity targets didn't include, very, very little mentions only of Indigenous peoples. And in target 3, which is 30 by 30, the conservation target, we have 3 specific mentions there of Indigenous peoples. The notion of Indigenous territories, the need to take that into account, to take Indigenous and traditional territories into account in carrying out conservation, the need to respect consent, free, prior, and informed consent, or the rights of Indigenous peoples in carrying out conservation, and governance, which we take to mean as respecting also Indigenous governance of territory. So yeah, these are I think some of the things that need to change in the way that we do conservation. And I think that some of the language that you can now see in the global biodiversity framework takes us towards valuing the right things and recognizing rights.
Great, Gloria, you had your hand up, and then maybe we can go to Bram to just follow up on this 30 by 30 and how that relates. So, Gloria.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention that as a practitioner, I think it's hard to keep up on track with the theoretical discussions. So I used to work in academia, and it was very interesting, and I was able to move forward with those conversations. But right now, it's sometimes it's really hard to take them, grab them, and making them practice. So I think that is very important to, like, I don't know, something has to slow down. I don't know if it's theory but sometimes it feels like it moves really, really fast, and it's very hard to keep up with everything from the theoretical perspective. Like, we're trying to apply one concept, and then that concept is already obsolete, or it's have been criticized, and then you have to move forward with another concept. So I think research could be helpful in that way. Like, how do we encompass time from the practitioner's perspective and from the academic or theoretical perspective?
Right, we have urgency and we have to slow down, and that theory and practice. But talking about new concepts and things, Bram, you've been working with convivial conservation, and you've also been like looking at that, challenging the fortress conservation things. Do you have any thoughts on the 30 by 30 target of the global biodiversity framework?
Yeah, no, I was, and maybe also a question for Jin in this actually, because studying the outcome actually of the framework, indeed, I think it's totally correct that indigenous territories, indigenous rights are mentioned many, many times. But at the same time, I still feel, on the one hand, that some of the traditional things in conservation are still very much sort of the leading sort of edge of the whole framework, right? So the 30 by 30 ID is still this idea that we need more area-based sort of protection, and we must get from about 17% of the globe to about 30%, you know, in 7 years' time. And just imagine, right? This is almost doubling from what we've done since 1960. So in 60 years, we've moved to 17%, right? Much of which has happened over the last 15 to 20 years, but still, right? That has been a painful and an arduous process. And now in the next 7 years, we must sort of double that. Now, I find plus in that 60 years, the extinction crisis has not lessened, but has actually worsened. So I find that really contradictory. And at the same time, on the other hand, and I really wonder, because I understand that in the negotiations, these things are never simple, right? I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people working literally day and night, are totally exhausted by the end of it, just want to go home and get something on paper. But it really feels like the new global biodiversity framework sort of, you know, wants to have its cake and eat it too, right? It wants to have all indigenous rights, and at the same time, you know, not make any really fundamental decisions about the economy. Who is actually going to lose in this process? You can't have it all, right? And there's certain indigenous or remarks in relation to indigenous rights and territories and practices, especially say, for example, in Target 10, that really talk about sustainable intensification, right? Further long-term efficiency and productivity of indigenous production systems. And to me, intensification, efficiency are the watchwords of, you know, an economy that always needs to accelerate, rather than one that can be a little bit more at peace with itself and find a more sort of balanced approach to human nature relations. And so maybe this is also my question to the others. What do they think about this?
So Jing, would you like to answer that before we open up for questions from the audience as well?
Yeah, well, I'll focus first on Target 3 or 30 by 30. You know, this was a proposal that caused a lot of debate within the Indigenous caucus, because on the one hand, you have the negative legacy of colonization and a colonized way of doing conservation, right? And many members of our caucus had firsthand experience of evictions in the name of conservation. So how do we reconcile this proposal to expand the protected area estate with the negative legacies of conservation on indigenous peoples? So we actually, as a caucus, could not agree on a number. We had no formal position to support any proposed number, because at the time there was also this proposal of 50 by 30. There were some indigenous peoples who felt like 100% of the earth should be protected, because, you know, allotting a certain percentage of the earth for protection could imply that the rest can be destroyed. No, so those were the kinds of debates, and what we settled on was to focus on the quality of conservation, and in fact also this equity element, which is also included in 30 by 30, right? And I think most of us already explored the different elements or the ways that we can implement this notion of equity when it comes to conservation. And of course, the other thing was the point that we cannot carry out protection of biodiversity just through protected areas, or even through other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. If we recall the negotiations in 2010, that was a very, very last-minute addition, and it was also intended to cover indigenous ways of protecting territory, you know? But the way that the concept of OECMs has evolved since 2010 until now is a very, very government-centric way of doing things, which is something that did not resonate well with indigenous peoples, which is why we said that if we're to carry out expanded, you know, we're going to expand the areas devoted to conservation, it cannot just be protected areas or OECMs, which are, or areas that don't have the purpose of conservation but result in good conservation outcomes anyway. So, many people were sort of pressuring us just to include indigenous territories in the notion of OECMs, because that's what we're doing anyway as indigenous people. So we're just governing our territories. The intention is not conservation, but the result is good conservation outcomes. However, there was this rebelling against the heavy administrative burden, the need to report every year and to prove that we are actually being effective in our governance. It's resulting in good conservation outcomes. So, can you imagine very, very remote communities without huge economic resources having to do this report every year? So that was one thing that was not favorable for OECMs. That's why we added respect for indigenous and traditional territories. And then we had to deal with, if 30% or 25 to 30% of the world is already IPs, indigenous peoples and local communities territory, then that means that we remove ambition from this target, because if we recognize indigenous territories, then we've already achieved 30%. No, so we had to deal with that issue. But then we said that, in many places, like in Asia, where I'm from, indigenous peoples are not even recognized as indigenous peoples, much less indigenous territories. So there are still some steps that we need to take before we can secure the protection of that 25 to 30% of the world that's occupied by indigenous peoples. So so I think that in terms of target 3 or 30 by 30, the way forward is to evolve new ways of doing conservation that includes recognition of territory as such, without having to impose so many top-down administrative requirements on the way that indigenous peoples govern their territory. Instead, we should find ways of securing the tenure, which gives indigenous peoples more power to resist biodiversity degrading activities on their lands. And then on target 10, I think we dropped the ball on that one. In the early days, we had the proposal to recognize small farmers and indigenous farmers, but it was dropped from the text. So I guess maybe the solution there would be to find ways to implement the framework in a holistic manner, so that we are able to bring in human rights, the rights-based language from the other targets into some of the other targets. So for example, respecting indigenous territories would result in respecting the way that indigenous peoples do agroforestry, for example, and smallholder farming, small scale farming and organic farming. Anyway, so yeah, thanks.
Thank you both, Jing and Bram, for raising all these really interesting points. So we want to open up the discussion to the whole audience as well. So we're running a little late on the schedule now, but I think we can take one question at least, if anyone would like to raise their hand.
Sorry, we have 3 questions. If we have.
We have 3 already.
Yeah, Juana, Genio, and Daniel.
Let's start with Juana then.
Hi, how are you? I want to be very short. I especially like what Bram Busha said, because I have always had the same feeling that we start talking about justice and transformative change in a very open and wide perspective, and then we end up talking about protected areas and indigenous communities without disregarding them and the importance. I think that we should focus more on the 70% of the land that will not be protected, and on the 99% of the population of the world, which are the ones that are really leading the pros and cons from biodiversity. I mean, I have always had this preoccupation. I'm an architect and an urban planner and a land use planner, and it really worries me that we keep staying in sort of the comfort zone of conservation. And if you think conservation is somehow the opposite of transformation. So we tend to keep on the comfort zone, and then I think that we should focus more on what is happening with biodiversity, ecosystem services, equity, fairness in how the costs and benefits of the different policies are being dealt with in non-protected areas and with local communities. I have said it many times, for instance, urban communities. So I respect what is being said about indigenous people, but I really think we should focus more. We have to shift the focus to the 99% of the world's population that is not in protected areas, that is not indigenous community, because I think there is where the big challenges still are.
Lila,
So
do you have a
Bram,
comment
I
to
like
that?
very much what you said.
Great, thank you, Juana. Lila or Matthew, do you have a comment on that? And briefly, and then we'll take the other two questions and then move into breakout groups.
Maybe Lila should, then I can follow up.
Sorry, I froze a bit. Matthew, are you going?
Yeah, I can go. Just adding a few insights from what Bram and Ioana have said in terms of this contradiction. I think it's just based on the idea that much of
He froze.
what the kind of conservation or the approach that we use in conservation, which is still rooted in this idea of separating people from nature. I think that sort of brings a contradiction. And I would also just provide an insight from Tanzania, because when we're talking about 30%, but in Tanzania, I think more than 50% of the land is conserved. So such kind of a dynamic, how do you take on board on that? And it's just something that has not been quite being discussed that much. For places where conservation is more than just at 30%, like in Tanzania, more than 50% of the land is conserved, is protected. So what is the meaning of that in all this conversation?
Wait, Lila, do you have a quick reply to that about the 70% and the 99%?
I know that was very controversial, and I think I tend to agree that it is flawed. We need to look at it all together, and we can't just separate out, protected areas versus the rest, because that perpetuates some of these sort of colonial also legacies of putting people in a certain space, these conserving the lands versus what's happening elsewhere. Whereas it's very dynamic, if you look at dynamic ecologies, people and nature coexist in very dynamic ways. And I think we have to look at that from local to global. And we really have to push back against some of these flawed patterns of thinking, institutional structures, flows of money and resources that kind of perpetuate these kind of biases. How can we encourage ways to the rich and diverse knowledges and practices around biodiversity to thrive? I think that's really more important. And the dynamism, and I've also different ways of valuing and valuing. Value is really important. Pushing back against these conventional indices of maps, I think, and mapping assessments. I think that's really, really critical moving forward. Also, and rather than demarcations.
Great, thanks. So was there one more question?
We're kind of running late, so we can also maybe
was I invited to do my question now, or shall I do that later? This is Dan Faith here.
Yeah, we could take a brief question, then we'll shorten the breakout groups a little bit. So Dan, if you could make it in brief, and we'll just respond.
I think we can take Daniel and Genio and together.
Okay. Shall I start?
Hi,
everyone. Look, I'm really enjoying this discussion a lot, so I do want to do more listening than talking, indeed. Most of my work has been in Papua New Guinea, and that has been kind of interesting starting 25 years ago because it's focused on multiple values of nature, associated issues of justice, and so on indigenous and local people's lands. But at the same time, it's been a big focus on global values of biodiversity and another form of justice that I haven't heard about yet today. I was almost going to say this evening, but I think it's only evening for me in this group today. And that's the idea of intergenerational justice. And so did my message come up in the chat? Basically what I say there, just reading it, is a key challenge then is to actually integrate global values of biodiversity, interpreted as variety of life, with the many, many local values of broader nature. So I make a distinction between biodiversity as variety and nature as being something that is just, huge in its multidimensionality. Justice and equity issues arise in both of those contexts, and they're both important. The summary for policymakers of the recent IPBES values assessment, in fact, concluded in its summary for policymakers that a lack of sustainability can undermine justice. Well, that's certainly true. The example it presented is interesting. It says, for example, declines in biodiversity reduce options for present and future generations to sustain a good quality of life, thereby compromising the principle of intergenerational equity. And they expand on that, of course, and I can expand on it as well. So the point here then, I'm just trying to page down to this then. So biodiversity conservation itself is one key basis for justice, which is interesting because a lot of people now don't talk about it that way. And that's an interesting thing to think about it. And when you say that, it does not mean you're denying the other work we do in Papua New Guinea about local and indigenous areas and all those issues of justice. We have to treat both of these. And the good news is the Papua New Guinea, I think, study illustrates a pathway where we can have both kinds of values, all these kinds of values, and importantly, these different kinds of justice. So the question is, well, how do we address these values and rights of indigenous and local communities and also achieve that intergenerational justice provided by the conservation of global biodiversity? And the example that I provide a reference to is our study, which actually started 25 years ago. So a lot of these ideas we can look profitably at old history and learn from it. It's not all doom and gloom in terms of the past and we need the revolution. There are lessons to be learned. And I humbly offer that paper, which is kind of a nice introductory review of that. And hopefully you can see that reference there. So I conclude, in integrating plural values of biodiversity and nature, this sort of approach, in fact, may support the transformative change that we need to achieve the 2050 vision for biodiversity. And I've popped in my email there as well, and welcome comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That wasn't really a question. So I think we have one more question to take, and I don't know if we're going to have time for breakout groups. Håkon, what do you think?
Well,
it's a conversation that can go on and on.
Yeah.
So many ideas and for research policy and practice dimensions of equity.
Yeah, and it's such a great conversation, and that's why it's going over time a bit, I guess. But I think it would be really great to have like 10 minutes breakout room so everyone can get together and talk about the ideas that have come up during this conversation, and maybe risk going a little over time, if you agree, Karen.
Yeah, so in the breakout groups, if you could, we're going to break into groups of 4, and those of us participating here will also join in them, and really, just briefly introduce yourself and really think about what is the biggest challenge for justice and equity and conservation, and how can we address it in practice? I'm sure Gloria would be very happy to be hearing about our, the solutions for practice. So yeah, just to share ideas, because we want this to be a very open conversation, and we'll then come back to take a few reflections and then wrap up. And again, we're a little bit, we have 20 minutes, so we'll do 10 minutes in the breakout group and then bring people back. So Rosario, if you could break us into groups, that would be great.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes to share. We have a few share any insights that came up in your conversation group. Yeah, does anyone want to, including the Jing, Bram, Gloria, Lila, then Matthew?
I can go first. Yeah, it was a very short time for a conversation, but one of the things that emerged is the need to break down the silos. So we were 3 in our group, and I'm a lawyer. One of the Juana is an architect. What is a person from your background doing in this space? But we need to value, the insights that people from the different disciplines can bring into the biodiversity conservation space. That's it. Thank you.
I can go next. I think it was very interesting. I agree that it was very short time in order to have a actual conversation, but I wrote down like 4 things that were very interesting for me. Please, first how we encompass what we say with what we act. So sometimes we put a lot of things on paper, but we are not able to put them in practice. There are a lot of new crises that past few years have brought up a new set of issues, and that bring even more complexity into an issue that is already complex. So the wicked problems are even more wicked now. Also, how are we going to include all of these concepts into policies that can be able to be put into practice? And finally, we have to acknowledge indigenous people's rights in order to, as a basic condition to justice. We're not going to accomplish justice if we are not including this acknowledgement of indigenous rights. I think that's the keynotes that I took.
Great, thanks, Gloria. Anyone else want to step up? Anyone from my group?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I have a horsey voice here. Good afternoon, good evening. So we were 2 in our group, Christina and myself. And, we reflected on very good conversation. And we basically, focused on target 3, what indigenous communities were really asking for a long time was, recognition of their territories and also protection of the indigenous knowledge. And GBF in various places, I think, has recognized, and this is a global policy now which national government have to implement. So, but I think I didn't see, and we sort of reflected on what is now required to implement it. And this is where I think we transformative change authors, we need to really provide what it takes to implement transformative approaches and pathways. And I felt while values have been plurality of values, multiple conceptualization values, I recognize are needed, but you also need to expand the knowledge base, because the yesterday's knowledge will not solve your tomorrow's problems. So you need to really improve the quality of both the knowledge, I mean, indigenous knowledge and also the modern knowledge, and also the rules. I think the target 3 very clearly says we need equitable governance. Equitable governance means where all the stakeholders have equal voice, and they, have they sort of sit on a level playing field and decide. And this is where the equitable governance will provide that equitable benefits and which will be shared. So I feel that what we will be really needing is what rules should be respected, what rules should be framed, how the rules should be crafted, and then what knowledge will be needed. Then value concerns this value, I think the valuing nature and valuing indigenous communities' conservation efforts, I think will be successfully implemented, and that huge target of doubling conservation area, effective conservation area within 7 years, we might be moving quite forward than we did with the IC biodiversity target. Thank you very much.
So I might say something from mine and Laila's conversation. We had a very nice talk. Nice to meet Laila. And we talked a bit about locals, so how to take care of, recognize, of course, the importance of including indigenous peoples, but who is local and how to take care of the locals that are, well, in Western societies, for example, where it's with long traditions, but not considered as IPLCs, and take care of that kind of knowledge that is kind of come from long time of farming, outdoor recreation, engagement with the rest of nature and being outside, and what's not neglecting and saying that the rest of us are modern, but there are also other experiences of the rest of nature in those groups that I think we need to build up, also to find ways for transformation in those urban societies that most of us live.
Great, thank you, Marie. I guess we should be closing now, Håkon, right? I feel like this conversation could go on and on because there's so many, we talked about education and really decolonizing the curriculum from a very kind of outdated paradigm for the next generations, but also with a little bit of hope that young people, Leilani pointed out that, like the people she teaches, they really get it about the human nature connections and things. So there is some reasons for that change can happen faster than we think. Håkon, any?
Yeah, that's great. I can also mention very shortly that we talked a bit about, I guess kind of barriers to improvement and transformation. So one thing was kind of practicalities and day-to-day stuff within policy institutions that you don't see so easily from the outside. And the other was the silos and sectorial governance systems that was mentioned earlier here as well, and how to better integrate different governance sectors. Yeah, so our time is up. So yeah, as you say, Karen, we should probably close now, even though this has been a really, really interesting conversation, and it's tempting to just go on, but
yeah, let's pass it to Rosario and she can talk about the next one too. And then we'll just be following up. And I think with all of us, thank you so much for a really rich conversation. And I'm looking forward to continuing it. Rosario, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, and all of you for your participation. Yes, next conversation is going to be on May 11, and it's going to focus on transdisciplinarity and the co-production of knowledge. So I am posting now the link so you can register. And I'm going to share also my screen so you can save the date and see the speakers. So I hope we can see you there. And thank you for all your insights. And thank you to all the speakers.
Yeah, thank you everybody for showing up. And it was really great to share the conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks for all the interesting points brought up today. It was really great.